The official cost to manufacture a Dior handbag, according to Italian court documents filed in 2024, is €53. The bag retails for €2,500. That covers everything at the factory gate: leather, labor, hardware, the hand stitching done in workshops outside Milan. €53. The documents came from a Milan prosecutor's investigation into LVMH's Italian manufacturing network. 3 subcontractor workshops were named. Workers were paid under €3 an hour. The bags they produced, destined for Rue Montaigne and Fifth Avenue, were invoiced to LVMH at a cost that barely covered materials. LVMH's 2023 annual report had already disclosed a 42% operating margin on fashion and leather. The shares still fell 2% because, for the first time, a court had entered the actual receipt into evidence. €53 in public, on the record. High margins in luxury aren't the surprise. They've been in annual reports for decades. The question is why the margin holds. Why does a gap of nearly €1,850 survive across decades, downturns, and hundreds of exposé articles that change nothing? The answer isn't deception, and it isn't irrationality. It's something stranger. A product whose value isn't in what it is, but in what it costs. A product that becomes less valuable the moment it becomes affordable. Once you understand that mechanism, the €53 bag stops being scandalous. It starts to make sense. So where does the €1,850 go? Open LVMH's 2023 annual report. The fashion and leather segment, Louis Vuitton, Dior, Fendi, Celine, posted €21.1 billion in revenue and €8.9 billion in operating profit, 42% margin. That outpaces Apple's 30%, Ferrari's 27%, and every fast-moving consumer category on the planet. Between €53 and €2,500, several hundred euros go to retail. The Rue Montaigne flagship costs more per square foot than almost any commercial property in France. The Bond Street boutique, the Ginza showroom, marble floors, trained sales staff, security that makes customers feel like guests rather than shoppers. More goes to marketing. Dior's campaign features Natalie Portman at an estimated €20 million a year. Ad magazine placements in Fashion Week productions, and a significant portion of every bag's retail price funds the machinery of desire, infrastructure that makes someone want the bag before they've touched one. Then there's heritage. Archive rooms in Paris, artisan programs in Normandy, a 90-minute atelier visit that shifts one customer's willingness to pay by €200, invisible to the buyer. That invisibility is part of the design. What's left, once you subtract retail real estate, talent, marketing, and production, is a margin most consumer goods companies would consider fictional. And it exists not despite the price, but because of it. In a luxury market, price isn't set by cost. It's set by what the lock requires. In normal markets, high prices reduce demand. Raise the price of anything, bread, petrol, a flight to Edinburgh, and fewer people buy it. This is the first principle of consumer economics. Luxury fashion violates it, reliably, at industrial scale for over a century. In 1899, Thorstein Veblen published The Theory of the Leisure Class and named what he observed in Gilded Age drawing rooms: conspicuous consumption. For certain goods, the price itself is part of the value. Cut the price and you cut the product. The demand curve doesn't slope down, it slopes up. The Hermès Birkin is the clearest running proof. Hermès produces roughly 1 Birkin per authorized boutique per week globally, around 70,000 a year. Demand outstripping supply by design. On the resale market, they trade at 2 to 4 times retail. A standard Birkin bought in 2010 has since outperformed the S&P 500. Hermès knows the resale premium exists. It's confirmation that the mechanism is working. A bag commanding triple its purchase price confirms access is genuinely restricted, which means ownership genuinely signals something, which means the next buyer pays the same price or more without complaint. So why doesn't every brand just raise prices? Because Veblen pricing requires something no brand can purchase, a credible, established perception of genuine scarcity. That's considerably harder to manufacture than the bag. What are buyers actually paying for? Not the leather. Excellent Italian leather goods exist for a fraction of the price from craftsmen in Florence. Not the construction. Artisans in Portugal produce technically superior work for a tenth of the cost. What they're buying is a signal. Robert Frank called these positional goods, things whose value derives from their rank relative to what others can acquire. A Birkin's function isn't warmth or beauty in any objective sense. It's position, a verifiable claim, legible to strangers at 30 feet, that the owner crossed a threshold most people cannot reach. This is why counterfeits are a structural threat, not a revenue problem. Fakes don't take sales from LVMH. They're mostly bought by people who couldn't afford the original. What they take is signal clarity. A fake Dior indistinguishable at 20 meters has cost the real bag a fraction of its function. LVMH spent approximately 1.1 billion euros on anti-counterfeiting between 2005 and 2020. That spend doesn't protect intellectual property in any traditional sense. It protects signal fidelity. A blurred signal is a diminished product. Anti-counterfeiting is brand maintenance, measured in the same units as a marketing campaign. You could spend 2,500 euros on a bag made for 53 euros and understand yourself to be entirely rational. You're not buying leather. You're buying membership in a club whose entry fee is calibrated to exclude most people. The price is the lock. The bag is the key. If the price is the product, the most dangerous thing a luxury brand can do is lower it. Burberry learned this in the 1990s when they licensed the signature check to manufacturers who put it on baseball caps, umbrellas, and discount accessories. More check, more revenue, more damage. By 2001, the check was appearing in British tabloids in contexts far from Knightsbridge. Pubs across England began banning customers in Burberry check. The brand hadn't lowered its prices, but by flooding the market with its signature, it had turned the signal from exclusive to ordinary. In a Veblen market, ordinary means worthless. The recovery cost a decade. Angela Ahrendts, hired as CEO in 2006, cut hundreds of licensing deals, pulled the check for most product lines, and rebuilt exclusion by reducing supply and raising prices. Revenue from licensing disappeared. It came back slowly, as genuine scarcity. The lesson was expensive. The asymmetry is the point. Destroying the signal took roughly 3 years of aggressive licensing. Rebuilding it took 10 years of restriction. Brand damage and brand recovery are not symmetrical, and that asymmetry is why every luxury CEO is, fundamentally, a conservationist. Hermès never made the Burberry mistake. It refuses wholesale distribution on its mainline bags, has turned down deals worth hundreds of millions, and maintains a waitlist that isn't a supply chain failure. It's a deliberate mechanism for keeping the signal legible and the lock functional. Bernard Arnault, the chairman of LVMH, doesn't describe his company as a luxury manufacturer. He calls it a collection of star brands, each with its own heritage, its own creative director, its own customer relationship. The framing is precise and deliberate. It is also not the whole picture. Behind the framing is a centralized manufacturing platform, Italian leather workshops, French ateliers, shared logistics, servicing multiple houses simultaneously, keeping input costs low, generating the margin that funds the storytelling that justifies the price. A Fendi bag and a Louis Vuitton bag may come from facilities 100 kilometers apart, running at the same efficiency. LVMH publishes nothing about manufacturing consolidation. It publishes at length about artisan training programs, heritage preservation, and the craftspeople in Normandy working the same techniques since 1854. Manufacturing efficiency and the perception of exclusivity are not in conflict, as long as you never describe what you're doing. The €400 million Louis Vuitton Foundation Museum, designed by Frank Gehry and opened in Paris in 2014, is not a philanthropic gesture. It generates editorial coverage, shifts cultural positioning, and justifies a price point that would otherwise require explicit defense. Architecture as brand maintenance. In 2023, this machine produced 8.9 billion euros in operating profit from fashion and leather alone. What you see walking into a Louis Vuitton flagship on the Champs-Élysées is a singular cultural experience. What you don't see is the standardized supply chain that made it for 53 euros. In the first quarter of 2024, LVMH reported its first organic revenue contraction in years, 2%, after nearly a decade of double-digit growth. Kering, which owns Gucci, was down 11%. Gucci itself fell 18% in the second half of the year. The story ran as a China problem. Chinese consumers had driven much of luxury's growth since 2016, particularly the aspirational tier, buyers just below ultra-high net worth, purchasing entry-level luxury as visible evidence of their own rise. When China's recovery slowed, that tier retreated. The deeper story is architectural. Luxury has always had two customer layers: the ultra-high net worth buyer, for whom 2,500 euros is a trivial sum and the price never registers as a number, and the aspirational buyer, who stretches, feels the price, and walks away when conditions change. Hermès barely noticed 2024. Revenue grew 5% in Q1 while competitors contracted. The Birkin waitlist did not shorten. Hermès had spent decades refusing to court the aspirational tier, not out of snobbery, but because the Veblen logic demands it. A brand protected by genuine exclusion is insulated from economic cycles. The 2024 numbers made visible what the growth years had obscured. Gucci and Dior had extended toward the aspirational tier through entry-level products, small leather goods, canvas accessories, capturing volume while diluting the signal. When conditions changed, the aspirational buyer left. The brand equity borrowed against went with them. The 53 euro Dior bag story ran in every major outlet in 2024. Dior's boutiques did not empty. The price did not change. The story didn't land where most exposé journalism expects, in buyer behavior. Because the buyer already knew, roughly, what the price was for. The person buying a 2,500 euro Dior bag on Rue Montaigne has a reasonable intuition that the margin is large. What she's paying for has already been established: decades of associations, a specific address in Paris, a legibility to strangers she doesn't need to explain. LVMH doesn't sell products. It sells a social instrument whose function depends on the price being high enough to proxy the buyer's position. The 53 euro cost is irrelevant to the transaction. Price isn't about cost recovery. It's about signal calibration. The receipt is beside the point. In every other industry, pricing eventually collides with cost. Competition drives margins lower. The gap between input and output narrows. Luxury fashion is the exception that has held for a century, not because it makes better things, but because it makes things whose value is destroyed by becoming cheaper. The 53 euro bag is still on sale in Paris for 2,500 euros. That gap, 1,847 euros and counting, is not a markup. It's the price of belonging somewhere most people aren't invited. And the remarkable thing is not that the system exists. It's that once you understand exactly how it works, it still works on you.